Welcome. Today we're looking at a fun little book called Dyson's Book of Swords. All the art, layout, and writing was done by the titular Dyson's logos. All the art and layout's very clean, there's no complaints there. Also, the art is really nice. Every sword has the name of the sword, the description of the sword, and also an art piece. Also, the book comes with 3 bookmarks that have both the description on the back and art on the front, so it also works for if you end up giving any of these 3 to your players, that you can also give these out as part of their little handouts at the table so they can easily just look at it to see what they do. So this book contains 50 magical swords, and it kind of falls into what I call RPG coffee table books. And that's not derogatory. What I mean by that is that the content's pretty light, it's solid, but you can just throw it down to your coffee table and, if you're waiting for your ride to work, or if you're just doing some prep, you can easily just flip through it, kill some time looking through, getting some inspiration or ideas, or, just enjoying the art and seeing what's in there. I'm a fan of books that have magic items like this because I often find I have trouble coming up with my own. It's not always an issue, but every once in a while, you just need a little bit of inspiration to get things going. I don't always keep them the same way. In fact, most of the time I tend to take one and use that as a base to make my own interesting magic item with it, because a lot of times they could use a little bit of work and that sort of thing. And this falls in that category of ones I can use just a springboard off of. Even if I don't use the description, I can still use the art, which is all really good, and that will work really well at the table for just like, hey, here's the sword you find, embedded in the corpse, or, at the base of the shrine, or wherever they might find it. And I like how this book doesn't waste your time. Like I mentioned, it's just the description, the title, and the art, and that's it. However, that is a bit of a double-edged sword, because if you don't deliver on everything there, if there's nothing else there to distract from the fact that that's all you have, you kind of need most of them to be bangers, and that's not necessarily the case here. Now, I do believe these are compilations from the creators' blogs, so it does explain why some of the earlier ones are kind of weak compared to later ones that are a bit more interesting, but I do think that kind of is a problem as a product, because I had to look into the fact that this was, a blog post, and even so, that still doesn't really, make up for it. It's just that it kind of explains why some of the earlier ones are a little bit less interesting, and the later ones are obviously, with more practice and more time, are a bit cooler. But I do think, in terms of a first impression, it's not great, and I'll show you what I mean, because the first sword is Shadow Cutter. Shadow Cutter. This is Shadow Cutter, a sword +1/+2 against all creatures that live in darkness. Now, the art's pretty cool. I like it. It's a pretty clean, simple sword. But that description, that's like baby's first magic sword, Like, that's a very basic sword. And the kind of people like me who buy these kinds of books, just hoping for inspiration, that's not really a sword that gives me much inspiration. That's not really a sword I couldn't come up with on my own. If I'm buying a product that, is supposed to have a lot of cool magic items that are supposed to be interesting, you are kind of expecting a little bit more than that. Now, I will say that coming up with 50 different interesting swords is a shitload of work, and I personally don't know if I could do that. I have a lot of creative counterparts that, do tables and generators and those kinds of things, and those people might be really good at doing that sort of thing, but that's really not my forte, just sitting there and coming up with these many. And I know this is over time, like I said, because it came from some blog posts. However, I do want to give some leniency because, again, smaller creator, they're also doing all the art layout and writing themselves, which is something that I completely respect and I think is worthy of a lot of praise, because that is incredibly difficult. And, if you listen to anybody talking about how they make stuff, a lot of them might do just the writing, and they might just leave the editing, layout, art, everything else to other people because it's just so much work. However, that doesn't change the fact that some of them maybe should have stayed in the drafts until, some more interesting things could be gleaned with those themes that you're going for with those ones. I do think that some of them could have definitely been, a good starting point, but probably should have been saved until more interesting ideas came to them, because some of these do come as pretty basic magic items that aren't all that interesting. Also, I think it's imperative with a product like this to really kick open the gates of some of your best stuff, and I realize that this, again, was probably, put in the order that the blog posts are put in, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best idea. One thing to remember for creatives is that you might think that the people who are buying your stuff already know you, already know the things you're doing, but that is almost never the case. Looking at my video analytics, it is way less than half of people coming back to watch my videos. It's almost always non-subscribers or new people who are coming to see my stuff. It is not people who know me or know the stuff I do. And that's why you'll often find me repeating stuff, is because there's a lot of people who don't have context for certain things. And it's the same with this, where it's like, sure, I might have backed the Kickstarter and known your blog and done all that sort of stuff, but that is not going to be the majority of people when you start selling this on like Exalted Funeral and Drive Thru RPG and wherever else you're selling it. And so that's something to keep in mind. But that really is the only negative thing I have to say. I do think there's a lot of cool ones in here, so let's go through a few of them. So the first one we have here is Breaker of Kings, and I think overall the powers are, again, kind of okay, but I think the sword is interesting for what it might represent in your game. Breaker of Kings. This ancient dwarven blade is known as Uzbad Markaful. the Breaker of Kings, or more commonly among non-nobles as the Breaker of Tyrants. The nicks and breaks in the blade seem to confer no reduction in its sharpness. It is a sword +1, but +3 versus nobles, kings, tyrants, and those of that ilk. What I find inspiring about this one is how it could fit in your world. Maybe it's being wielded by a revolutionary who's going around, murdering nobles or kings or barons or whoever, and they're really bringing change, and it's like an illegal sword. Just by owning it, just by knowing the person who owns it, you could be putting your life in danger. There could be bounty hunters, there could be whole armies going after this guy just to try and destroy the sword, because it's not so much that it's the best sword of all time, but this sword has such a history. It is so drenched in blood of monarchs that by itself and what it symbolizes, it is an illegal weapon. It is a weapon that is considered completely blasphemous to the area. And so I think that is a super cool one. Even if it's not that, you could even go maybe there's an undead necromancer king who can't be killed, but this blade is the one blade that can actually cut their head off and properly kill them for good. But maybe it's somewhere in this giant dwarven mega dungeon, so you could have a whole campaign just try and get the sword because that undead necromancer can't be killed. So you have all these quest lines, and even if you do get, maybe there's other factions that are trying to get it. Maybe that undead necromancer king is getting others to go after it. Some of these aren't just giving me ideas for how they could be used in combat, but how they might be used as part of a story, which is usually the best way to do magic items, because in a lot of fiction, a lot of the guys like King Arthur aren't going look at my +3 sword. They're going this is a sword that can cut through anything. This is a sword that symbolizes that, I am worthy of ruling, or I am this or that. So that's why I really like this one. I think it's a really cool one that I would absolutely use in a political game. I think it's a really fun one to look at. Even if it's not that different from another magical sword, I think, again, what it symbolizes is what's so powerful about it. All right, next is Lash. Lash is adorned with a dark metal cable or tentacle entwined around the blade. It is a sword +1 that absorbs the animating magic from golems, constructs, living statues, and other magically animated objects. It deals 1d8 additional damage against these targets and heals the wielder half of that bonus damage rounded down. However, part of this healing is replacing, meaning that in time, the wielder is made more and more of animated metal. I like this one for all the reasons that I like magic items that change characters over time. I think those are some of the most interesting magic items if they're in the hands of the right player. A weapon that makes you more and more like a golem or construct is a great way to test yourself as a role player, as well as dynamically change you mechanically over time. Perhaps the changes have some inherent bonuses, like, a higher AC or damage to certain kind of resistances, but maybe as time goes on, the more you change, the more robotic and numb you become to the world around you. Hell, maybe in classic Golem fashion, powerful spellcasters and powerful mages and whoever else who might have some abilities over golems could perhaps have a higher chance of maybe controlling you, maybe casting spells on you to sort of make you follow their orders, making a save to resist against those kinds of orders, maybe even causing some issues with the party. Again, this comes into that thing where you might need to be really good players to actually do it well, because having one player potentially, fully take away the agency of another character could be really interesting if they do it properly, but could also end up being really frustrating in the long run. But I think overall, that idea is extremely terrifying to me. I think seeing that change over a long period of time would be really disturbing. Not somebody falling deeper into depravity and chaos, but just ceasing to be them. Anyway, let's look at Anarixa. Anarixa. Beaten into a sword-like shape in the soul forges of the inevitable city, Anarixa was once a demon who rebelled against its kin. Now a sentient sword +1, all those of infernal or celestial origin must save versus spells when struck by the blade, or suffer a -2 penalty on saving throws for the next hour. This effect may be applied multiple times to the same target. I'll be honest, I kind of just picked this one because it reminded me of the Smelter Sword from Dark Souls 2, because that was my first Soulsborne game, and for a long time my favorite before being dethroned. I love a big old chunkus of a sword, and this one having stacking penalties on saving throws is the exact kind of totally broken magic item stuff that I love. I think that is incredibly brutal. This is the kind of sword that you can really strategize around, where the party works together so that the fighter can really get their shots off on the big demon they're fighting, so that it gets all these penalties from the stacking saving throw penalties, and then have the glass cannon wizard finally fire off a huge shot, trying to make sure that absolutely this demon will not pass its save. And the last one will be quick, is Ruiner. Forged in the last days of Zorus for the war chief Kurthan, this blade was named Ruiner by the Zorusan conscripts, as it kept turning up at battles which ended in horrific slaughter on both sides. In the last 3 months of the war, Ruiner went through at least a half dozen wielders. Ruiner is a two-hand sword +3. It is a cursed weapon, rendering the bearer unable to give it up once wielded, and drives them into a rage every time it is used. In combat, it grants an additional +2 to damage, and forces the wielder to attack a target, friend or foe, each round unless there is no one within reach, at which point the frenzy ends until the blade is used to attack again. It's a really cool looking sword, it's legendary and horrific, and I think they would be perfect in a much darker campaign. I have no notes, a lot of these layer ones are really cool. Anyway, that is Dyson's Book of Swords, and while writing the script for this, I could easily come up with stuff right off the top of my head, which is exactly what I want with a book like this. I want there to be interesting things, even just little tidbits. It's the same thing as like tables or generators, where I don't need you to do everything for me, I just need something to springboard off of, and I think this book does it well. With that said, I do think there are still some pretty weak ones in here. It's not like most of them are weak, and a lot of them are still pretty basic ones that if you are newer to the hobby, or if you are somebody who does like, simpler items, I do think that instead of just a magic sword +1, you could take one of these like Shadow Cutter or one of the other ones where there's a little bit more lore or a little bit more things in the background that, just gives it a little bit more spice, but they're not necessarily like the craziest ones out there. Anyway, I guess my recommendation, it's not like a you gotta have this book, but it's solid. And if you're in the market for a Book of Swords, I mean, it's hard to go wrong with this one. I do think that even if you don't like the descriptions, you do have 50 different pieces of art for swords, and that in itself is pretty useful. Maybe just pick up the PDF if you're not totally sure. It's not super expensive, and it's a pretty easy purchase. Anyway, I have immense respect for any creator who can both write, do layout, edit, and do the art. It is something I am incredibly envious of because I cannot do all those things. So I think it is worth mentioning that I am looking forward to seeing what they do next. I'm looking forward to seeing what other products they make, because I think from what the back of the book looked like, it looks like Dyson is constantly getting better at what they're doing. So I'm sure future products are going to be even better. Thank you so much to my patrons. I love you guys so much. I really appreciate the support. It means a lot. And to everybody, I do apologize that I have not had a lot of stuff put out recently. This time of year is absolutely brutal for me. I am completely affected by seasonal affective disorder. It is rough on me. So I'm going to try and get some more stuff out. I am working on a huge project for the channel that won't be out for a good while, but that is kind of why I haven't been around too much. But hopefully I'll have some more stuff out for you guys soon, and I look forward to that. Anyway, have yourselves a good one, and stay safe out there.